I'd like to talk today about the address of Archbishop Gomez on his reflections on the church and new religions in America. And this is part five of a series. He talks about in his address that the church has been anti-racist from the very beginning, that the notion of the church being a racist church is kind of an impossible notion when you think of the beginning of the church and the reaching out of the church to all nations, all races. The whole concept of the church, of course, is it is for everyone and all are welcome. Unfortunately, he says, in a very honest remark, we have not always lived up to this. And of course, we know that the church has not. The church has rejected certain people. The church schools have rejected people of color. There's a whole church religious orders. Candidates for the priesthood have been rejected, and people of color sometimes have not been treated well, and minorities well by church parishioners. So there is this history as well. Obviously, the concept of the church is all inclusive, but the actual reality of the church has not always been. And he says that. And he says we have to be better Christians. We have to really follow Christ and follow the example of Christ and reach out to all. He uses the example of Dorothy Day, and he says her love for the poor was grounded in the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, and the works of mercy. And certainly she would be a good example, I think, for all of us of someone who did reach out to everyone and who was against racism. But I wonder, in terms of Archbishop Gomez's condemnation of certain movements that were movements of struggle. Certainly, Dorothy was involved in a lot of struggles where even leaders in the church gave her a hard time. So, this idea of the struggle against oppression, certainly Dorothy also modeled that as well. So would she be, on the one hand, commended and on the other criticized because she was involved in many protests and demonstrations and things of that nature? Um, he also mentions the witness of Venerable Augustus Tolton, who was the first priest of color in the United States, who was native to the United States, and certainly he really experienced a lot of discrimination, where he was rejected by certain seminaries, certain parishes rejected him. So he certainly encountered a lot of discrimination within the church. But certainly his example, he persisted in spite of that discrimination, and certainly a great example of patience and commitment to the faith and commitment to the priesthood, a beautiful example. Archbishop Gomez talks about the danger of a new tribalism, which certainly is a danger. Tribalism is always a danger, and I think tribalism occurs when we don't engage in dialogue with the other, when we just stick with our own tribe. And so if someone has a different viewpoint, to listen openly to them and to listen to their concerns and try in some way to be responsive if those concerns are legitimate, and that would be certainly important. And that really is a way to get around tribalism, to have that healthy dialogue, that encounter with the other would be very important. He says we cannot be passive in the face of social injustice. And so a little bit of a confusing message, because he talks about one of those movements that he condemns is the social justice movement, but then he says quite clearly we cannot be passive in the face of social injustice. So, specifically, again, that would be the area for dialogue. What particular movement is he talking about there that he is rejecting, and what would he find acceptable? Certainly, we can't be passive. We have to engage, and we have to advocate, and sometimes, demonstrate, and sometimes, challenge those who are in power when it comes to social injustice. He also says that fraternity cannot be built through animosity or division, and certainly that is true. We don't build fraternity and sorority, and we don't build a community through animosity. Uh, and I guess he sees some of these movements as demonstrating animosity. Uh, and we can understand that certainly there are some movements that go to excesses, and we would condemn those that riot and burn things and destroy property. Those certainly would be condemned, and maybe they would display a lot of animosity. And those movements which try to divide society rather than bring society together. Difficult, though, sometimes to achieve that unity when there is differences of opinions about how to proceed. And I think that is the problem, to engage in that dialogue, which does take time and patience to engage in. And sometimes people get frustrated. They want to see change happen much more quickly. And we can understand that and listen to that and certainly advocate for those changes that are necessary. He talks about the fact that the hand of God guides us. And certainly, as people of faith, we would very deeply believe that we would look for God's guidance, we would look for God's hand, we would look for God's help in terms of guiding us. He then mentions that we're approaching the 490th anniversary of the apparitions of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and that this he points to as the true spiritual founding of America. And one can sense that the apparition of Our Lady of Guadalupe is certainly very important to all of us. The fact that she came and spoke to a peasant, and she really advocated for people to follow the Lord and to be more spiritual and more loving in their approach. And certainly that is extremely important in terms of the faith life of so many people, so many of our sisters and brothers. Then he talks about a spiritual awakening in America, and very important that we have that spiritual awakening. Overall, what would we say about the address of Archbishop Gomez? Certainly, many fine points that he mentions to reflect on. But overall, when we look at it, certainly there's a lack of specificity. To what movements of social justice is the Archbishop referring? Is he referring to those movements like the Catholic Worker Movement with Dorothy Day, a movement for social justice, or is he referring to another movement? Why is he condemning those movements? Again, with no specificity, it's hard to really have a complete dialogue with him. There's also this problem with vagueness. We certainly speculate because of the vagueness, well, which movements are included. Some have speculated, for example, he's talking about Black Lives Matter, but he never specifically mentions that. And certainly Black Lives Matter itself includes a lot of different groupings within it. There are different chapters in different cities, and so again, to mention something with some really detail would be helpful, so you could really dialogue. And of course, the particular problem is with his use of social justice, since it is such a constitutive element in Catholic moral theology. When he mentions social justice as a movement that he condemns, that certainly is very problematic to include that. And really, it's such an essential ingredient in what we teach in terms of our faith, that we must strive for social justice for all peoples. And he, at a certain point in his address, as I observed, does mention that it's important that we strive to achieve social justices. So, I mean, it's again a mixed message being sent there, obviously. Um, he talks about this elite leadership class, again, never really defining it specifically. So, to whom is he referring? Is the elite leader? Some people would say the elite leaders in our church are the bishops. He's not certainly he's not referring to them as elite leaders. So, what specifically, is he referring to? The president, the Congress, the majority leader, the minority leader? Are they the elite leadership class? Is it business people? Is it stockbrokers, who is this elite leadership class? Is it university presidents? Well, which university, again, it's very vague. He talks about the fact that people complain about religion getting in the way. But again, how does religion get in the way? Where does it get in the way? What are the specifics? Certainly, religion could get in the way if some religious leader intervenes where they shouldn't intervene in the political process. That would be religion getting in the way. And then also he talks about getting in the way of religion. Well, again, the specifics would be important. So, in a lot of ways, I think the basic criticism of the address is the vagueness of it, and certainly it would be good for him, I think, to develop his themes more precisely, so we can have a more complete dialogue with him.